Hello.
Greetings, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Chris, good afternoon.
Hello.
Hey, Ken.
Hello, Tom.
Here comes Michelle.
Sounds like not a lot of introductions will be necessary.
Yeah, we've been doing it for a while now.
Only if there's dementia involved.
Yeah.
Who's on the phone here?
Yeah. Remind me who you are again, Ken.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ken is our new intern.
Yeah, exactly. Every day makes me feel like a new intern. No worries.
Hey, lovely. Anyone else joining? We got Jennifer May join. Okay.
Jennifer Bernstein is not joining today because
good.
I'm taking this one and she's taking one next week.
Excellent. Super.
That
It
works.
sounds like Bill has a time limit here as well, so.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Something came up.
Okay, so maybe we'll ask you to pipe up earlier rather than later if you have any questions or thoughts or anything to provide for this. Okay. So
Okay.
don't be shy.
No, I've been trying to think of things to embarrass Ken.
Hey, wait! I thought we weren't going to tell him about that meeting.
Shouldn't be that difficult.
Well, it's nice, friendly crowd here. Okay, so the good news is we don't have to explain what we're doing here, right? Ken and Michelle, you have a good idea. I'm going to take myself off of video and take notes. And you guys got the questions that we sent to everyone, but especially for Bill, but for anybody, we don't have to stick to these, and you guys have a good view of what we're going to use this for. This is all about the scan that we're doing, and in particular, I guess we want to hear a good bit about consent to share, how that came about, what it is, because not everybody reading the report will know that. I mean, we all have become very well aware of it, but that's not going to be true for everybody who reads the report. So, and the thing I'll add to that is, don't worry about stuff that's already online about the work you've done. What we could really use is other insights into, in particular, on consent. How the process works, what benefits it brings to the table, what's the learning we can get from what you have done. Does that all makes sense and is obvious? I know. Again, unless somebody wants to do it differently, we're also using the same questions for each interview as a start, so we have a lot of apples to apples when we start comparing things and writing up the report. Both Ken and Michelle, describe your consent project. What do we briefly, and what do we need to know about it? What does the world need to know about it? Either of you can go first. I guess Ken should start.
Yes, Ken, huh?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I suspect most people understand what part 2 is about. And so I'll just go over it very quickly. Part 2 protects both the patient information confidentiality as well as the treatment confidentiality. In other words, any treatment that was done for part 2 patient, both the patient and the information associated with that patient for that treatment is covered under part 2. Now, there has been changes to part 2 I believe the last one was in 2017. And that sort of parsed out what is substance information versus clinical information non-related to drug information, which under HIPAA could be transmitted out of band, if you will.
Ken, could you just speak up just a little bit? I don't know if it's audio on my end, but it would help.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not having a problem hearing him.
Okay, well, I turned it up a little bit, so is that better, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. So did you get what I said so far?
Yeah.
So I don't have to remember what I said, and that's a good thing. So at any rate, so in 2017, I believe, was the last update to part 2, which tried to say that data non-related to substance use information could be exchanged with others without consent. So, so there's that. Of course, most substance use disorder treatment facilities were very leery about exchanging anything because it's very difficult to parse out pieces of information and send that along with no consent versus direct part 2 information related to their substance use disorder and so on. So
Hey, Ken,
yes.
quick question. Did that come down in the law and legislation, or did that come down in the Federal Register?
Yeah, it came down in the federal register and then was put into part 2 as an update to the regulation. There's no law associated with that change.
Just so it's a final rule from 2017.
Correct. So, and then I believe it was in the CARES Act. The CARES Act changed the way part 2 is being, or is supposed to be changing, right? So the CARES Act made a part 2 consent an opt-in, opt-out. And if you opted in, they sent all information available through the HIPAA TPO process. And if they opted out, then you could not exchange any information related to part 2 for that patient. So in some respects, it made it easier. So I think treatment providers thought, and then in other areas, it makes it more difficult because if the patient opts in and you share information, once that information is shared, it can be reshared and shared for the rest of its born days, right? But once patient opts out, from that time forward, then no data can be exchanged, no new data, I should say, can be exchanged for that patient for part 2 information. So it creates somewhat of a problem for providers in that they have to be sure that the patient is still opted in before they share new data, right? And so the fragmented environment we're in with providers and so on makes it very difficult to know, is that opt-in through an HIE? Is that opt-in through a provider? Is the opt-in at a national level? Do we have a place to go to check to see if they're opted in? And so on and so forth. So, I mean, in the scheme of things, the way HIPAA works is if you share information without consent, then you create a HIPAA breach, right? Now, for a small part 2 provider, they may tolerate it for, once, twice, 5 times, whatever, before they, bring the hammer down upon you and say, you've committed a HIPAA breach and now you owe us X dollars, right? So this is kind of where we are. We're in the twixt and the tween, right? They postponed the CARES Act regulation for some period of time. And to be honest, I don't know what that period of time is. Whether it was a year, 2 years, 3 months, 6 months, I don't know. But at any rate, that's where we are. So the original part 2, or at least the 2017 version of part 2, is still in practice, and until such time that they that the legislation said differently. I think they had 1 or 2 year extension. It was originally supposed to be done by March of 2020. And so I'm not 100% sure if it's 2022 or 2023, or if it was supposed to be 2022 or 2021. So I'm not sure exactly where that is. I haven't had that much time to follow the goings on of Congress.
I think soon is the word you're looking for there, Ken.
Yeah.
That's what they always say, right?
Right. Sometime in the near future. So the problem with Congress is that they never look at the whole picture, and then they do a off the wall part of something and think they've solved the problem. And then they let the industry, et cetera, worry about how to implement it, right? So as you can see, or hopefully you can see by this explanation, that we have a huge gaping hole in how to deal with the opt-in, right? Today we opt into HIEs, but that's a local/regional environment. And so they think they're in control, right? But if your New York patient goes to California and tries to get care, and they want your records, they may or may not be able to send them to California from the New York HIE Bronx or whatever to make those records available. Now, some say they can, some say they can't. Who knows? I don't know, because I don't do it for a daily living. So at any rate, that's kind of where we are. And basically, in my opinion, we need a national API to determine whether somebody is opted in or opted out to have their part 2 content exchanged. So that's where we are, I think.
Michelle?
I think, yeah, I don't think there's anything to add. That was a very thorough explanation of that question. So what problem are you looking to address? That's it. In a nutshell, that's it. And I looked, Ken, I couldn't find a date. They don't have anything posted on SAMHSA yet of when those new regs will be released.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me with the change of administration out, the people that were in there are out, new people are in. And quite frankly, the people they put in there, I'm not sure of their competence or not to get anything done, but that's a different issue.
Yeah.
But
So
Could you talk about your consent to share, the one you came up with, and its role in the field? In other words, have people seized on it? Have they not used it enough? Is it a sufficient model for which, in what domains? Can you talk a little about sort of how it fits into a bigger picture?
sure. I mean, and Bill can jump in here anytime he wants to when he thinks I've gone off the rails. But there are a lot of part 2 facilities across the states that don't use electronic systems, and the electronic systems that they do use are not part two sort of knowledgeable, and they do things often very much by hand. So
Just to add to that a lot, any of the facilities that are even able to, that I've come across in Maryland and DC, any of the providers who do SUD treatment, at best can segment that data out, and that's limited. And the other thing that I've seen, there's a small ability to create a patient panel and share a list of patients. So for instance, they can share a list of very basic patient demographics to say, this is our patients, so that then the hospital who's discharging could see that list of patients and know where to send that patient back to in the community when they're discharged. So it helps a little bit with transitions of care, but I would say less than 25% of the practices are even capable of doing that.
yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine. Bye.
Oh, so when I was at SAMHSA, people would send me these paper consent forms and say that they were Part 2 compliant. And I had to tell them, stop sending me this stuff, because it's a paper consent form that you fill in data into, and it's not computable, right? So I'm like, it may be 42 CFR Part 2 compliant in the broadest sense, but it's not computable. And without a computable consent, it's difficult to determine what data you can share and what data you can't share. And you have to then redact that information manually, right? And, people get their, black writing ink pens and stuff, and then scratch stuff out so that they don't want that to transfer to whoever they're, faxing the document to, right? When we built the web version of a Part 2 document, which what was it called, Bill?
Which,
It's
on the consent to share document?
no, I'm talking about the we built a web system for Part 2 type providers, right? And I'm trying to remember what we called it.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in that, but
Okay, well, it's been implemented in some 40 states and counties or so across the US.
Certificate of confidentiality?
No, it's actually a system that included consent management within it, right? And so the way, one of the ways it dealt with information was, if a patient consented for you to see the data, then the data would show up in your, web view of the information. And then if they decided that they wanted to rescind that consent, then the data would no longer display. And so.
Hey, Ken,
Oh,
did the,
WITS. It's called WITS. WITS. You remember WITS, don't you, Bill?
oh, you're
spell,
talking about
spell that?
it's WITS, but it's much more than the consent. That's why.
Well, right.
That's
It's a
why I was
system.
baffled. It's a much
Sorry.
larger system than
Right.
consent.
It's called the Web Infrastructure for Treatment Systems. is
Yeah,
what
it's actually in about 45 states and counties right now.
So-
But my question on the consent to share,
Uh-huh.
You built a really nice application. It's open source. And so my question though is, where today is it actually being used? Because that's one of the things I've been trying to find out. And a lot of the original, like we had, a county in Minnesota that, went tested it and no longer exists. They're not using it. It was sort of the state saying, "Yeah, okay, it works." So I'm having difficulty. We have this slick application and it's open source, but I'm having difficulty seeing, states or counties that have followed through and using it.
Yeah.
Wait, I thought you said it was implemented in 45 states. You mean they
Well,
have
that's
it, but they don't
That's
use it?
WITS.
that's WITS. That's a different.
Oh, okay.
It's
The
yeah.
consent management was built into the WITS application. It didn't use consent to share because at that point in time, we didn't have a concept of consent to share, right? That
Right.
came along later. And so, yeah. So Michelle, are you using consent to share in what you're doing now?
We've got it set up in 2 different instances. Neither one is far enough along to be accessing that piece. They're still that because it's part of a case management tool,
Right.
Omnibus Care Plan. So they're using it as part of the Omnibus Care Plan. The Omnibus Care Plan does a Smart on Fire launch of the consent to share tool. Both programs are their intention is to phase the consent piece in, but not in this first year. They want to consent it or phase it in for next year. It's the second year of development.
Right.
Because everybody's kind of waiting for that legislation to be released. So nobody really wants to put any money into, because it'll have to be adjusted.
Right.
It's based off of the current standing regulations, but it'll have to be adjusted with these new regulations. So everybody's kind of like, well, before we spend any money on it, let's wait and see what the new regulations are.
Right. And that's part of the issue, right? I mean, the new, opt-in, opt-out is 180 degrees different than the way part 2 worked before. There's little, if any, need to do data segmentation, for example, because, with an opt-in, you're opting in to share all your data, right? Including part 2 and all the part 2 data, not just some of it, right? So I can understand, the hesitation to want to go and implement this. Now in Otter Tail County in Minnesota, they did a very successful pilot there with consent to share, and the state was writing an RFP to actually adopt it statewide. However, COVID occurred, and then that kind of got sidestepped for a bunch of other things COVID related, right? So I'm not exactly sure. I haven't talked to this to Minnesota in the past.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I mean, Ken, sorry.
Yep.
So I'm familiar with WITS because our county's substance use disorder treatment facility uses it. So, and
Yep.
I understand that consent to share was created as a functionality of that, I guess. So can you explain a little bit more about how, I understand, I heard you say it's open source. How universally can it be used on other systems? Like, can it be an add-on to any case management or database, or how broadly can it be picked up and moved to another system besides WITS, in other words?
Well, the current consent to share isn't used by WITS. WITS has its own internal sort of consent management piece that we work with a guy named Stephen Sherman from GCR or something. They were part of University of Maryland or something. But at any rate, we worked with him, and they already had a consent capability to some degree, and we enhanced that in WITS to be able to display data when you had a consent, and not to display part 2 data, that is, when they didn't have a consent. So I'm presuming that's the way it still works, and it didn't need a consent to share capability, as it were, because it never went outside of the system, right? And so that was, the way it was architected and implemented way back when. And that was, I don't know, circa 2000 and something. So it's been a
And a
long,
quick clarifying question, then I want to ask Bill if he has anything else before he has to drop off. When you said that if a patient consented, data would show in a web view of that information. If they decided to rescind, then data would no longer be displayed, right? So what happens with that data? It's not displayed, but you still have it, or it's deleted?
oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's still in the system. It just is not displayable for whoever's looking at it that didn't, that there's no consent.
So there's still the issues of protecting it and all that stuff.
Right. Yep.
I think that the data wits, at least my experience with data wits in DC, is not just a consent management tool, it's also a documentation tool.
Oh,
So it makes
absolutely.
sense that that data would be there. It's just the consent piece of it either allows access or doesn't allow access based on the consenting of the client.
Correct.
Does that make
Just-
sense?
Bill, anything before you leave us?
Yeah, no, I think my major interest was trying to find out where, around the country, the actual consent to share is
Sure.
being used today. Because, being part of what we best practice or promising practices, we want to see, I want to find out why it's not being used as much as I think it should. I mean, I know we have the problem with opt-in now, but even prior to that, it just didn't seem like it was being adopted very quickly.
Right.
And Bill, that's correct. And I can, or I don't know if you have access to a company called Book Zerman. They took a version of consent to share and version of somebody mentioned OCP earlier.
Yep.
And pulled them into a product set called Care Nexus, which they are marketing. But to my knowledge, I don't believe there are any takers at the moment.
Yeah, I think to your point, Tom, that the Care Nexus, I think, was bad timing when it was finished because of COVID. Everybody, I've seen their product. It's a nice product. I think that it would get more takers had everybody not been. So we went into opioid crisis. And all of a sudden, the opioid crisis awareness was huge. Everybody started talking about it. There was money for it, and all of that development could happen, and people were moving it forward. And right when it was like, okay, we can start adopting these things, COVID hit. And so everybody's kind of been side railed with COVID, but there's no reason whatsoever to think that we're not going to get back into this opioid crisis mode sooner rather than later, because one of the big fallouts of COVID is an increase in overdoses, an increase in suicide rates using narcotics, an increase in the opioid crisis has only gotten worse. So I think it's been a lot of timing constraints around the adoption, but it's coming. And another thing that's coming, and which will be helped by COVID as well, is that there's a glaring light on the lacking electronic capability of most mental and behavioral health facilities. The CDC, when they've called for information, they've gotten virtually none because they just don't have the ability to share effectively. Even anonymized data, even data that doesn't need to be protected, even like pulling reports to even know what they have on record. And that's, I'm speaking from my experience in Maryland and DC, but also on calls that I've sat in on that are much more nationally focused about the shortcomings. All this money went in for the past 20 years has been dumped into electronic medical records for healthcare providers. But up until 19, the mental and behavioral health practices were all but ignored. So they didn't get any of those meaningful use dollars. But I know at least locally in Maryland and DC now, they're absolutely looking at that and trying to increase the ability of that group of providers, that population of providers, including DDS, the disability services as well, to see if they can't support them the way they supported all the other healthcare facilities in trying to get them digitally up to speed. And post-COVID, everybody's number one tag word is interoperability. So there's no part of me that think that that's going to be, that is the focus. That's what's going to be coming.
Quick question before Bill jumps off. Bill, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, just a quick question. I know you got to jump. Just to follow up on those two things. One is, should we try to schedule time with Minnesota? Because if they got sort of to the precipice, COVID happened, I'm wondering if you think that would be useful instructionally, and or the same with CareNexus.
Well, the latest I had on Minnesota, I talked to the consultant last week who
Okay.
actually worked on that, and he said that right now the state doesn't have any interest in following up on what Otter Tail County did.
Right.
So it could have been the COVID related. It could have been now there's another decision that they're making and moving forward. But he told me last week the state was not interested.
That's the answer to that.
And the San Diego HIE is doing a similar chunk of work, trying to make the consent process more manageable. But again, they're still looking at data segmentation and things of that nature. Now, whether they change when the new regulations are minted or not is a different issue, right?
And I'd say one of the other issues right now too is that there is so much money coming down to the states on the rescue plan, on the enhanced match, that they are just going crazy they got their plans in and how they're going to do this. And I mean, now they're focused on spending a lot of money and spending it quickly.
Yep.
So can I ask a follow-up question to something I asked before? And if it wasn't answered because I'm clueless, I'll own it. You just got to tell me. The consent to share application, how universal is it? Like, could it be attached to, can it be entered into an Epic system, for example, and Epic could use it as part of its online consent process?
So
Well, they could, but they won't.
Okay, so technically it could.
Yeah. I mean, Cerner and Epic and all those guys have the ability to launch smart on fire applications. So consent to share can be launched as a smart on fire application. So sure, they could use it. And then, consent to share is two pieces, right? It's the front end, which allows a patient to create a consent, and then the back end, which takes that fire consent and uses it to parse through an information content that they're expecting to share with somebody for, and they want to take out the part two content, right? So, and the back end does a 2-pass process, right? The first pass, they mark everything that they think is part two, and then on the second pass they redact it, and they redact it primarily because most, if not all, EHRs do not take into consideration the confidentiality codes that are put into the information content to say whether it's restricted or not, and so on. And so if they don't keep track of the confidentiality code, then they'll, that data can be read by anybody, right? So that's why it went through a 2-pass process, and with the second pass doing redaction. The other thing, which is a shortcoming of part two back end, is that all textual content was redacted as well. And the reason, of course, is that we didn't have anything to read through the text to determine whether it was part two content or not, right? So it all just went.
So this leads me, I think, seamlessly to the next question. especially, and what caught my ear especially was Cerner and all those folks could launch consent to share as a smart on fire application. You said, but they won't. So that leads to the question: what are the primary roadblocks you've encountered along the way? Why don't people do it? You can be as specific as you want or general, but what are the roadblocks?
Yeah.
What do people need to be aware of?
So there's a company called NetSmart that's very big in part two in mental health environments and stuff. And they flat out told us at SAMHSA that they would never, well, they're enjoined from using open source software in their application products. So so there's those kinds of things that go on as well, right?
They're enjoined from using it from some kind of
Yes.
legal action?
Well, their board has told them that they cannot use any open source content in their application.
All right, so here's, if I remember correctly, NetSmart is the one that's eating up all the little companies, right?
Yep.
Like they're working on building on market share. They're nowhere near Epic, but they're buying up all the little programs. So that potentially is really a problem.
So
Right.
Ken, that's a business decision because they want it to be proprietary so they can make their money.
Yeah, and then with open source, you have to make sure that it's not broken before you implement it, right? Such that people can come in through the open source door and then mess with your system, right? So there are those kinds of security issues as well.
Yeah, Ken, is open source the issue for Epic and Cerner as well?
I would suspect so, but they weren't ever involved in part two with SAMHSA, as far as I know.
So that business considerations and related security issues are a roadblock, an obstacle, a detour. What else?
Cost. Most substance use providers can't afford to buy systems, let alone pay to have systems implemented and so on and so forth. WITS was successful because it was relatively inexpensive to implement, right? Consent to share is somewhat implementable cost-wise, but there are it's really for specific instances of providers doing work in an electronic environment, right?
Yeah, not many of them have fire compliant tools they're working with to begin with. So implementing the open source consent to share, oh yeah, sure, that's cheap, it's open source, except that they'd have to buy a new system because their system doesn't allow for fire launching.
So is this a lamentable problem that can't be solved, or should some of that money the states have? So how do you address problems like this, that people don't have compliant tools, the costs are high, they have proprietary issues? Is this just a pessimistic scenario in which this ain't going to happen, or what?
Well, I think you'll see more implementations from county and state providers and so on to warm up to the idea once part two goes opt in, opt out, right? But even then, it's a significant amount of work that has to be done to implement that nationwide, right? And that's what needs to be done in order to facilitate the proper adjudication of the consent, right? It's either an opt-in and it's there and you can share, or it's an opt-out and it's not there and you can't share. And, you know, you really have to have a national API that you can go to facilitate whether somebody has a valid opt-in or a valid opt-out, right? And again, you know, if you don't do that, you risk, you know, creating a HIPAA breach, right?
Do you risk what? I missed that.
You risk creating a HIPAA breach,
Uh-huh.
which, you know, OCR is responsible for HIPAA, right? And if you mess up, they'll fine you, right? Part two, the, you know, current part two, you have to actually go to a DA in the state or county or wherever, you know, they have one. And you have to present your case to them, and then they have to decide whether it's worthwhile to pursue it, right? And why is that? Well, the first breach cost is $500. So, you know, first you have to find the DA, then you have to give them all the data, then they have to go out and research your problem and case and so on and so forth, right? And then they have to take it to court, and then they have to sue you. And then you get a whole $500 in compensation. So, you know, if you go out there and look, I don't think you'll find any case law around part two. Right.
That's my understanding too.
Yeah, simply because it's too expensive to go through the process for a $500 rebate.
Yeah, Ken, you know, a couple of years back, CMS started, I guess, a couple of bad wagons and was sort of holding out the carrot of, you know, states being able to draw down enhanced federal match to do things like, you know, put the patient at the center of your care and all of those kinds of things. And, you know, integration of clinical health, behavioral health, and the, you know, the data sharing associated to enable that. Has that died on the vine that you see, or do you see a revival of that in the near future?
Well, you know, like buzzwords like patient-centered care and that sort of thing. It's a buzzword, and I'm not sure how well it's adapted and implemented into systems today, right? Like, you know, are you going to reinvent your whole Epic or Cerner EHR in order to make it patient-centered? Highly doubtful, right? You know, they've got billions of dollars of investment in these things, and they want to flog them as best they can, right? So there's that. And then, you know, patient-centered care is more than a buzzword, right? And, you know, so is digital transformation and so on and so forth, right? So the problem, of course, is that EHRs like Cerner and Epic have some minimalistic capability to shield data, right? But nothing on the level of something like consent to share and so on, right? And you know, there's not a lot of clinics, substance use clinics that use Epic and Cerner and so on, because they're way too expensive. Even NetSmart's way too expensive unless you're a pretty big behavioral health provider, right? So the problem, you know, becomes one of expense and adoption and costs of you know, paying them license fees every you know, day or week, month, whatever.
Yeah, but they did it. The clinical practices did it when CMS basically created an incentive program that allowed them to draw down money for doing it. You know, there was pay to play, and then there was pay to perform, and all that. Do you see that as a workable model to increase adoption in this case?
Well, potentially. You know, we'd have to kind of look at, you know, how they structured it and how much money they spent and what value they got for it and so on and so forth, right? And did the dollars you know, save CMS money, or did they just, you know, pay more dollars out and got less or the same amount of treatment and so on and so forth, right? So, you know, I don't know if CMS has done any of those evaluations, and if they have, whether they released any data associated with them and so on. And, you know, got up, because I never heard them get up on the top of the mountain and yell down, you know, yay, we saved, you know, billions of dollars by, you know, allowing people to do X, Y, and Z, right? So with the lack thereof, it seems to me that, you know, they probably didn't get a very good payoff for the money they spent. But, you know, I don't know, because I've never seen any data to say otherwise.
Hey, I want to keep going. We're gonna, the clock is ticking. So first I want to say, Daniel, please jump in anytime. We only have a few minutes left, so if you've got something, please go for it. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that are here with a new one that occurs to me that would be really useful for Ken and Michelle to answer, because you're close enough to what we're doing, both with the scan and the consent technical solution that we're trying to develop ourselves. With that background, what I want to get at is what technical, legal, or innovative solutions did you identify or utilize, and what are the key lessons that you learned along the way? So I think those are reasonable to put together, but with a backdrop of, we're doing this scan, we're developing this technical solution. What are you learning? What have you learned over the years and now that would be useful for the scan and for the tool? What does the field need? What do companies need? What do health systems need, or systems outside of health need, that we can actually help give them with the work that we're doing based on your own, you know, on what you've learned?
I can speak a little bit to the clinical side of things as opposed to the technical side of things. So looking at workflow, I think that it's very, even on these calls and in our discussions that we have, we're very tech heavy. And I don't think there's really a question of technology being the issue. We can do it. It can be done. That's clear. I don't think that's a question. But I think on the flip side, the workflow, the burden, the actual doing it seems to be the problem, much more so than the technology of it. And I feel like, my humble opinion,
Yeah,
as a nurse for almost 30 years, there's such a focus on protecting this data, as there should be, but not at missing the point of, for every one person who needs to have their data protected, there's 10 that are just flailing because they can't get the help they need, because they're not supported, because we're not sharing their data. And I think that there's got to be a shift of some sort to not ignore the privacy of individuals, but to not ignore the needs of those who aren't worried about their data being shared. They're posting what they do all over Facebook. They're not worried about their data being shared or not being shared. They need help. And I feel like that's more and more coming to light. I'm hearing more of those discussions, like when I talk to clinicians, just with the consenting process that we're doing in DC, talking to the clinicians, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the behavioral health practices were saying things like, oh, we can't share data. We're not allowed to acknowledge our patients. We can't share data. And it was they wouldn't even talk about it. But now what I'm hearing is, what do we need to do this? Because we've got too many people that we can't help. Like, they go to the hospital and we lose them. They call EMS, we lost them. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they're okay. They move around, very transient, many of them, not all of them, of course. And there really needs to, I'm not saying, I never want to say shift away from privacy and protection of data. Absolutely not. But it has to be equal. We've got to not step away from the challenge because we might do it wrong. We have to keep fighting until we get it right, because there's too many people suffering from not sharing the data.
Is that a cultural, so what needs to change? Technology is an issue. I bet nobody here will argue with you. But something needs to give in order for it to change.
I feel like it needs to come. I think it's
culture, education. What is it?
I think culture is one thing, but it's a strong argument coming from the legal side, I believe. My personal opinion is everybody looks to the lawyers and the legal side of what's the safest thing to do. How do we do this? And I think that we get it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole of, well, we can't share data because this could happen, because this could happen, because this could happen, because that's kind of the, like that one-off, trying to protect all the way down the rabbit hole because of a one-off or because of many one-offs. And I feel like the legal team are the ones that can really get in there and say, okay, let's measure all of this and figure it out. And how can we address this from a regulatory standpoint so that we can data share? The technology is there.
So I would say I totally agree with what you're saying, Michelle. And I think that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the feds are in their, rewriting of HIPAA, not rewriting, but, as they update HIPAA in part 2, they're recognizing that there needs to be more sharing, that HIPAA already allows for sharing of records, not necessarily part 2, but sharing of records for care coordination. So that the good news is that's definitely where the feds are trending with regulations. The bad news is, exactly as you say, compliance officers, particularly if they're lawyers, have an easier time saying no than yes.
Yes.
And that's one of the cultural shifts that needs to happen, is that compliance officers tend to be hired because they keep people from getting sued. And there needs to be a greater, work on the legal side of things to really educate compliance officers, that, well, actually the law does allow this. And yes, part 2 is still a little stickier than HIPAA, but if you want to do it, these are the known risks. Get it back to your client. Your client can make the decision of, do they feel the need to share the patient data because that's what patients want, and the entity is willing to take a little more risk than the compliance officer is in order to meet that patient and ever increasing provider request for sharing. Yeah, and I will say that in my 3 years working on these issues in New Hampshire, I have seen compliance officers coming around a little bit. So I do think that it's, in some places, it is moving in the right direction.
How do we push it in the right direction? If you wait for something to happen in and of itself, it takes, and there might be good momentum and education. It takes longer than if there's advocacy and, a driver. Are there efforts to do that?
We have to advocate for those who need and want their data shared. I literally have got a handful of IMD providers in the district that have told me my patients couldn't care less who knows that they're an addict. They've been an addict their whole lives, but they want their EMS, when they respond to them being unconscious, they want them to know. They want the hospital to know. They're struggling with this disorder that they're not able to overcome. So by going down that rabbit hole and being so I don't want to say overprotective, being so protective of privacy, we're not protecting the ones who deserve the same level of protection. I guess that's my point. We've got to change that mentality.
So Adam, some of it is advocacy at the federal level around regulation change, and some of that is happening. And I would go out on a limb and say that under Biden, OCR is probably more likely to be entertaining that kind of stuff, but rules don't change overnight. You know what I mean? Like it can be a multi-year process of, and they just finished getting comments on HIPAA. I saw the comments were posted, so we're actually waiting to see some more regulatory updates. Ken, I don't know if you know more about that than I do. So I think it's pushing on the regulatory side of it. And some of it I think is outside of our control because it's providers themselves, as Michelle is saying. They have to be speaking to each other and pushing from the field.
Well, there also has to be dollars to back up what they,
Right.
change from a legislative perspective, right? So, to go from part two to HIPAA opt-in is a huge change, right? And there has to be dollars to support the effort to facilitate the ability to do that, right? So Michelle and I submitted a proposal to NIH to do just that, and it got good reviews, but they didn't fund it. So the question is do you search out private funders to do that job, or do you continue to try to refine it based on their comments in order to get an NIH grant to facilitate that and so on? And so on.
Ken, I mean, one of the models that I think might be helpful pattern to look at also is the situation with broadband, right?
Yep.
We've been sitting around with this digital divide for a long time. People have been lamenting about it for years, and no one would pay attention to it because there was no economic upside for the carriers.
Sure.
Right. And so now all of a sudden the federal government is like opening the checkbook and handing states and counties blank checks to go fill your broadband holes in your neighborhoods. And now it is the absolute front of mind issue for every state CIO, every county CIO in the country.
Right.
And is this particular issue, shall we say, have enough constituency to generate that kind of interest, legislation, money, implementation dollars, et cetera?
Yeah. And it's hard to say, right? Michelle may have a better perspective on that, but the field's very fractured. Got a lot of mom and pop shops out there. Are they going to march on DC and demand something?
Fragmented is the best word. I mean, they're coming together, but even in a city like DC, or which is seen as, they see themselves as a state. They are the state of DC,
right?
And their money is really kind of relegated that way. And even there, trying to get a unified voice that would be able to do what you're suggesting, Tom, it's difficult. And that they're one of the worst. They rank very, very poorly when it comes to opioid use and overdose.
Yeah, Michelle, actually, I think one of the more important use cases that you said earlier in the call is that, COVID was a tremendous distraction, but people shouldn't forget that the opioid crisis isn't over.
No, it's worse.
And is that the rallying cry, like the broadband, like the push for electronic health records, that could induce this kind of thing? I mean, I appreciate people are saying, not now because we're still dealing with COVID, but could that be the compelling event that could induce what we're trying, the situation we're trying to produce here?
And so it's not like the federal government didn't supply opioid money to try to abate that, right? So the question is there any will at the congressional level now to want to put more money out for opioid addiction, et cetera? That's the issue that we face, right? We didn't do a huge, great job with the billions of dollars they put out on the street for opioid addiction. So the problem becomes one of from a legislator perspective, am I throwing good money after bad, blah, 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 even though the circumstances changed and the circumstances on the ground level have changed dramatically from the time they put that opioid money out on the street. So those become the problems of trying to get money from the feds, right?
I would argue that it's also a political issue because of the divisions in government and how many things are already trying to focus on that they will not do because of those divisions. I was going to, in a smart ass way, say, let's just hire compliance officers under 30. But I do wonder in the real world whether this, in an evolutionary way, is in fact going to change because a generation is coming up that has very different views of privacy.
Yeah, but the government works on regulations and legislation, and Congress, regulations are derived from legislation, right? A government agency just doesn't decide one day, hey, we're going to create this regulation or change that regulation when there's no legislative incentive to do that, right? So people have to remember that Congress is in control of the purse strings, and that you have to lobby Congress in order to get anything monetarily passed down, right? Federal government or federal agencies do not have the capability to write regs just to write regs, right? You have to be directed to write a reg by the legislature.
Right.
So I have a couple of quick things. I know we're over the time. If everybody could just indulge for a moment. One is, it seems again, okay, Chris, that's great. There's a couple of things. One is, it almost sounds like there's so much anecdotal information about people saying, please share my information. We expect you to share my information. I've heard that personally in multiple states, doing sort of focus groups and interviews and those kinds of things. So I'm wondering if there's not a role, and maybe, maybe one of the, what's that agency? Anyways, maybe that's being done already as part of a national survey, or we conduct a national survey that says, what's the expectation around sharing information? Because my guess is most people are going to say they expect us to be sharing their information already. I would be totally surprised. So that's kind of a different set of data that can be brought in to say, people are expecting this. That might be able to help on the attorney or the privacy officer side of things. That's
well, I think that's already been done by legislation to change the way Part 2 works, right? And so there's always a lag between the time a legislative event occurs, like CARES Act that says you got to change Part 2. And the ability to implement that on the ground without any support from a federal perspective or whatever, right? So, is it important to private organizations to take that on as a capability? Is it, part and parcel of our RJ Reynolds or whatever funding people out there to go to the Congress and say, look, you need to put your money where your mouth is, and you just can't change all this without any funding to go along with it, right? And those are the kinds of things that Congress does because they listen to the people that are getting paid to go up there and tell them what they want them to do, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so they do it in a half-assed manner with no capability of monetary support. So, of course it's going to fail.
Right. So I just think that sort of from the mouth of the consumer directly, we've done that in multiple states and cities, and it changed. It's very different from what the leadership believes is the reality.
Sure.
And a couple of different places. That's one thought. A couple other quick things. One is there's going to be a ton of money coming out of the opioid settlements in states, right? There's $26 billion just got approved. So there's going to be another flow of dollars that are going to be coming down that maybe there's a way to, sort of corral states to say, hey, this is going to be useful for us to address this issue. Maybe there's an opportunity to deal with that in that regard.
Sure.
So to that point, what about, just listening to what you're saying, what about if there was some kind of a tool drafted to help? So, okay, so you've got this regional group of organizations that are gonna try to pilot a consent piece or
Yeah.
for SUD, having like offering tools to help them make sure that they're capturing the right metrics, make sure that they're capturing what we need to take to Congress, to take to the legislature, and say the impact, to make it more impactful, because you've got people trying stuff, but they're not doing it in an apples to apples kind of way. They're not capturing the right metrics. They're not looking, there's one program that I'm helping with in DC, and I was like very on a side, not consent-based, but helping with this program. And the whole time I'm listening to them tell me what they're doing, I'm thinking, oh my God, why aren't you capturing it? You're getting this data. Why aren't you putting it into reportable fields? You're putting it in text. Are you out of your mind? Like, this is what's going to build your next, so you have funding for this program, but you need funding for the next program. And all of that data is what's going to build your funding for the next program. I don't think that that's recognized by many of these organizations, especially the smaller ones that are doing these pilots, that are getting the funding now, and that's leading to these failures.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Having a way to inform grantees of the metrics we need to move the agenda, I guess.
I just wonder, listening, it all makes sense. And I wonder who does this, who takes the reins and says, here are the metrics, here are the organizations that need to know about them. Here's how the implementation can take place.
Well, Adam, let me just jump in really quickly on that one. Because we're over here. One of the things we're doing is, we have this conversation coming up with ONC about consent, right? So they've expressed interest. Ken, I think you got an email the other day about that. And they've got a lot of folks on there who are, I think we've caught their attention about potentially how this could support existing programs. So it seems to me that, they've got the coordinator in the name of the darn organization. It seems like in ONC, if they were to really look at, and in addition to just healthcare and SUD, there's the other social determinants that also require the consent piece, which we really didn't talk about. So is there a uniform kind of engine? That's kind of the argument that I'm thinking might be the most expeditious. They've got the credibility, they've got the mandate to do this. They've got to do it relative to FAST and some of these other initiatives that are out there. They're connected on the healthcare side. It seems if we can deliver that message that says, this is something everybody needs in healthcare, in social care, in education, in substance use disorder. That seems to be a viable place where we can actually go implement it, do the metrics, do the consumer work, really test out the technology in places that really got to go do it. They can make care coordination happen. They got to go do that.
Well, Mickey is a veteran of that process.
Yeah.
And he certainly gets it. And if he's championing, Secretary Becerra, and they're championing in front of the Congress, that's kind of how you put the will with the money and the authorization to do something, which is really what it's going to take.
Right. And then you have to make sure you get the money into the right people's hands to do the job, right? So and the thing is if you're going to Congress to get them to give you more money, they better be doing that lickety split, because we'll probably be under a CR here within the next couple months, right? And then with a CR, you'll have the opportunity potentially to get input into what new funding might look like, right, when they actually pass another omnibus bill or whatever to fund the government, right? So that's kind of where we are, and there's a very short time frame here to get some package put together that, wants government, to fund, right, as a, and it'd be best as a separate line item, or, included in a budget for example, NC or whatever. But, you just have to make sure that the money goes to where, the people are going to be able to implement it.
Right.
So that it just doesn't get wasted away in some
Yeah,
little
absolutely.
corner hole somewhere where,
Yeah.
like,
Here you go, there.
It
And,
can be the next infrastructure plan, Ken.
yeah, and you can't, I mean, you can give the money to ONC, for example, but they have to be, they're gonna put out solicitations and so on and so on and so on. Versus if, Congress directed the money to go to such and thus, you'd get a lot faster response and a lot better output for it. But
Is there
No.
anybody in Congress who gets this, who could be a champion of it?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it takes.
Yep.
Well, the consortium that the integrated care kits came from out of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation
Yeah.
is doing that right now. They've got a bunch of different senators involved who are interested in this, and so that's a route that I've been continuing to sort of. And they've got FaceTime. They've got FaceTime. So
How many successes occur?
yeah.
All right.
Right. Thanks, guys.
Anybody final words? And before you are released into the wild?
Well, did we answer all the questions?
God knows, but we know where you are.
Yeah.
But thank you immensely, Ken and
But
Michelle, and everybody who
Yeah,
participated here.
to your point, you guys are all involved with the work groups going on anyway. So as we draft this up, we would invite and
Oh, absolutely.
more than invite, cajole you guys to make sure we get it right and sort of add the commentary to it. So we make this, and we're hoping that this becomes at least a product that we can point at that sort of addresses a lot of the issues that are all fragmented now, right? There's a piece of the answer in San Diego and in CRISP and in New York and in Minnesota. We can have a place where that comes together, at least to point at it and say, these are the things that we need to do to really make this happen based on this pretty erudite group of folks that would hopefully be useful.
Hey, actually, there's one more thing I want to just add and alert everyone to. So we put together an outline of the report that we're going to write on this subject, right, for the scan. And that's not just going to be a report to Robert Wood Johnson. That's going to be a shortish white paper giving a lay of the land for everybody who wants to use it and learn from it. And so there is now a working document in our SharePoint that everybody can feed into as you have the time. If you have a thought, if you want to describe something that you described here, but want to elaborate on, there is a framework for contributing to that. We will send a link to everybody working on this project so that you have access to that. And we strongly urge you and invite you to participate. If you have 3 paragraphs or 13 that you think it would be useful to insert there, please do so. And I'll send everybody the link in due time so that you can have access to that.
I think
Sure.
you did. I think we have it. I
Yeah.
opened it earlier and
Well, the team co-leads have it. Not everybody else yet has it, but will.
yeah. So the one just real quick thought is that I feel like while consent to share right now is very much so geared to part 2 data, realistically, the consent to share framework is going to have to shift once the regulations are released and we know what those finally are. And I don't know the stats, but I would venture to say, in my experience in Maryland and DC, that a substantial part of social determinant of health needs comes out of the same population when it comes to kids being in foster care or not
Sure.
being in foster care, when you
Sure.
talk about housing needs because they can't keep a job, employment needs because they can't keep a job. I mean, I think you run into, I think there's a huge crossover between your social determinant of health needs and the population of substance use disorder, people who are affected by substance use disorder.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
so I think that there it would make sense, would make a lot of sense for the consent to share model to consider that, to be considered as part of, or, to consider this, the SDOH.
Well, you still need a front facing interface for the patient, right? And
Well, patient for all the providers, that's permission based. So you can hear what they are allowed to look at and what they're not allowed to look at. Even, are they allowed to look at any data other than name and date of birth?
right.
Or
Well, but that's more, getting into the OCP territory versus consent to share, right? From a consent perspective, we just have to be able to create consents that are related to data that needs to be consented to have access to, right? School data and so on and so forth. They're not going to change their rules to an opt-in,
no.
such and thus probably, right? At least in the near term, and so on and so forth, right? So, the fact is that consent to share creates a FHIR consent, and that FHIR consent can be read in and processed computationally, right? So it's the back end things that you have to be concerned with now because they're changing, right? From a back end perspective, if you opt in, you have to make sure the opt in is still valid, right? And that there's no corresponding opt out to that opt in. And if there is, you can't share new data, right? And then it becomes an issue of what's new and what's old, right? So again, there's degrees of complexity when you look at these things, but the fact is that the system has to change, or systems have to change in order to facilitate congressional intent. So there we are.
Right, and there are some things like we've been exploring that there's a perceived need for consent, but says not necessarily, there's no legal requirement, right? So, or that we've seen in terms of federal legislation around, TANF, SNAP, and WIC, as far as I've seen.
Well,
very limited restrictions on sharing that information. Although the perception of the privacy people are that, yes, you do need that. So even if you're not to the earlier point, even though you don't necessarily need it, if we had a consent mechanism that said, yes, I do it, even though there's no federal legislation requiring it, you're going to get past that hurdle and that risk aversion, I think.
Well, yeah, possibly. The thing is that most people won't do anything without some kind of legislation to give them ground to be safe on, right?
So we'll get legislation that says there is no legislation for this.
Well, you can try that, but
Well,
basically.
Daniel, it's interesting that you're saying that, because the other end of this, in terms of, we were talking about culture earlier, there's a huge misperception out there amongst providers in general about what the liability around this data sharing really is.
Right.
And it tends the view of it, and the same goes for medical malpractice for that matter. The view of it is this big, ugly liability issue, and turns out it's almost to the extent of a paper tiger. And there are not a lot of compliance officers out there that are aware of that.
Right.
But if you were aware of it, you'd probably make different decisions. So that might be another angle as part that goes with part of the package is to make people aware of, how to right size their risk. And you might get to yes more often.
I think that's exactly what San Diego chose to do. They took a somewhat bold attempt to say, show me the legislation and then show me the, outside of HIPAA, show me the, the people who have been actually fined on some of this on FERPA. I don't believe there are anybody's been fined on FERPA, although they're scared to death of it. So, maybe that's even part of the report, sort of the myth, sort of myth busters here is,
Yeah.
There's been $20 million worth of fines on HIPAA related, but everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting. Is there any case law on FERPA?
The FERPA folks we're talking with in California, Elizabeth Estes and Rebecca Gudeman, no, there's not. I mean,
Right.
there's no people aren't getting busted for it. So it's a whole different deal there.
And so it becomes the same as part two, right? The legislation may not have provided any kind of recourse for fines and so on and so forth. Or if they did, they made it so arduous for the people to get to sue somebody for
Right.
breach, right?
Right.
That they just can't do it, or
Right.
they won't do it, right?
I have to say, my son is away at college and they are extremely crazy about, they won't share any of his data with me,
Right.
but they have no problem sharing how do I pay his bills.
Well,
Apparently that doesn't
Right.
fall under
That's
FERPA.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you remember, Michelle, money talks and bullshit walks, right?
Yeah. So Daniel, when you publish the report, you should give it to Michelle. She should go over to MSNBC and do an expose piece, draw attention to the issue, and then you follow that up with, get Senator Schumer to the set and start talking about all the money that's going to come down and all of that.
Right.
Wow.
I'm with you, Tom. We'll do a road trip.
That's
And we'll grab Ken and Michelle along the way when we go to Humphrey Building. Let them know.
Yeah. Well, they throw me out. Michelle would be fine, but they don't want to hear from another bureaucrat about changing stuff.
We can wear one of those masks, it's just
Right.
caught in this.
You just wear your mask.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
We won't even know. We
Right.
won't even know.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, guys.
Okay,
Thanks so much.
guys. Well, thanks so much. You have a
Okay.
great one. We'll talk to you.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.